But this talk today emerges out of my book project on maritime piracy and longer histories of attempts to regulate commercial mobility in the Western Indian Ocean. Approximately 90% of global imports and exports currently travel by sea are on around 93,000 merchant vessels operated by over 1 million seafarers. The Western Indian Ocean is a central hub in this global shipping economy. Between 22,000 and 25,000 vessels transit through the Suez Canal each year, and every day 3.3 million barrels of oil are transported through the Bab el-Mandeb. From 2008 to 2012, a dramatic upsurge in maritime piracy transformed this sea space, bringing together a disparate yet interconnected range of actors, from coastal fishermen to insurance adjusters, from livestock to naval sea vessels, united by having a role to play in the problem of piracy. No matter what intervention people argued for, from increased naval policing, more robust law enforcement, or even development interventions on land, piracy and pirates are seen as legacies of state failure and the absence of a centralized government in Somalia. Without denying the real purchase of this framing and the hardships that many in Somalia have incurred in over 20 years of statelessness, my work pushes back at this equation of failed states and piracy in order to historically and ethnographically render a fuller and different understanding of what piracy entails. I argue instead that thinking piracy as an economy of protection better explains its standing in the Western Indian Ocean today. My understanding of protection emerges from a series of historical and contemporary encounters, and is best described as a claim to tax, a form of work, and a mode of exercising jurisdiction. I suggest that maritime piracy, and specifically the kidnap and ransom economy that developed from 2008 onwards, is a system of protection characterized by forms of regulation and economic logics that have longer histories in the Indian Ocean and go beyond piracy. Protection thus offers an alternative view into the intertwined processes of law and economic practice, and a way to productively move beyond dichotomies between predation and policing, to show how encounters on land and sea, in Somalia and elsewhere, frame engagements and contestations over governance, profits, and mobility. I begin this talk by locating Somali interactions with the world of counter-piracy within a longer narrative of European incursions in this oceanic space, to highlight multiple and competing regimes of protection. The next section focuses on the contemporary world of piracy. This economy, built through principles of risk pooling, entailed the distributions of debt and credit. By juxtaposing the risk pooling of piracy with the risk management practices of maritime insurance, the final part of this talk will bring into the same frame these cooperating and often competing regimes of protection and their productivity for understanding processes of law, economy, and forms of mobility beyond binaries of state and non-state, formal and informal, offshore and onshore. A sea of protection. Hassan liked being called a pirate, not Borad, the word for bandit in Somali, or even a more sympathetic rendering of Badhin Tabaha, a savior of the sea, popularized in recent journalistic accounts that recast piracy as a local response to problems of overfishing and global exploitation. Call me an Aban, he said, which translates as protector, or just use the English word pirate, he would tell me. Those are words that indicate Somali prestige. I became a big man through this business. It is important to me. In contrast to stories of desperation or fishermen turned pirates, Hassan emphasized his importance in the status of pirate protector, a status he performed daily by hosting gatherings, mafrishes, that entailed watching movies on his big screen TV while chewing khat. One evening, instead of the local usual Bollywood movie we would watch, I found myself watching a documentary on Somali piracy, produced by a Kenyan television channel. At one point, the American admiral in charge of the counter-piracy task force appeared and talked about the drastic decline in piracy in the month of June, following the deployment of US warships. After I translated what the admiral said, Hassan and his friends laughed. Confused, I inquired about this joke. He turned to me and said, "It's funny that the Americans claimed success for eliminating piracy in June. Everyone knows you don't go out to sea to work then. It's the rainy season. When the waters calmed and the winds died down, we returned to work and in fact captured many ships that year. This moment of humor, built around a shared understanding of seasons and wind patterns, highlights a vision of the Indian Ocean as a peculiar and intimate space, where access and navigation are known to those who understand shifting currents and seasonality. American warships that saw their presence as reducing piracy are the latest, then, in a long series of interlopers in this space. In the first section of my talk, I locate these warships and contemporary counter-piracy within this history of encounters at sea. Encounters, I argue, were about protection. From norms regarding obligation and debt to calculations about the cost of oceanic expansion, protection was a central frame through which a variety of sojourners, from local chiefs in Somalia, encountered each other in this moment. An analysis of this historical archive shows how these encounters shaped new forms of regulation, economic regimes, and political authorities whose legacies continue to resonate in this oceanic space today. I begin with two brief examples from 19th century Somalia and connect them to a longer history of European expansion. The first is from the southern Somali port city of Brava. In the early 19th century, the leaders of Brava began a correspondence across the Gulf of Aden. Thwarted in their attempts to tax British and Italian shipping and accused of acts of piracy by the British, they appealed to Sultan bin Sakar al-Qasimi of Sharjah. Beginning with hadith and Quranic injunctions, these letters aimed to construct a world of protection using a language of obligation and debt, and called upon a shared religious ethos. Citing the Al-Qawasim as guardians of Muslim shipping in the Western Indian Ocean, Brava appealed to the Sultan of Sharjah for protection from the two pirates, the British. No evidence indicates that the Sultan ever replied. Having come across these letters in an archive in Sharjah, I was surprised, though perhaps that surprise was somewhat unwarranted, when I encountered them again in 2012, this time printed in a booklet at a donors' conference for Somali security sector reform, hosted by the current ruler of Sharjah, Sultan Muhammad al-Qasimi. In my second example, I highlight a 19th century economy built through the redistribution of shipwrecks and contestations over ideas of ownership and property that continue to resonate in this oceanic space. The port cities of Puntland, which lie a few hundred miles north of Brava, are known today as major pirate ports. In the early 19th century, this region and its Majortine inhabitants had developed a ferocious reputation for plundering vessels that were shipwrecked along the coast. From May to November, when strong currents and gusty winds blow from the south, a whirlpool often develops just north of Ras Hafun, and ships unfortunate enough to get caught in it were tossed westward to the rocky coast between Hafun and Alula. When this happened, nearby residents would converge on the site, capture survivors, and loot vessels. The taking of shipwrecks was understood as a variation on a long-standing practice among clans primarily along caravan and livestock trading routes. Known as Aban or Siara in Arabic, this practice of offering protection and escort in return for payment is a regional mode of engaging with the outside world. As the historian Lee Casanelli notes, each clan required some access to major nodes and arteries of commercial exchange. Each guarded that right to oversee this trade as jealously as it guarded home wells and reserved grazing areas. Tribute, or protection money, extracted from caravans in transit, was thus a source of income, but also prestige for these local communities. The Majortine transformed this practice of Aban to fit oceanic trade and proclaimed themselves protectors of the Somali coast. They declared that anything that arrived on shore was under the protection of the Bokor, the traditional elders. Aban provided the means by which local Majortine leaders assured themselves of political power. They supervised the sale of goods recovered from shipwrecks in Arabia and distributed proceeds to their kinsmen, creating obligations that could be exchanged later for rights in labor, water, and the use of pasture. Of course, the British and later the Italians rarely saw the Majortine as protectors. drawing on a law of shipwrecks where property lost at sea remained under previous ownership unless it was willfully jettisoned, and what they considered an essential obligation to protect free trade. The British blockaded the major ports of Bosaso and Berbera along the Red Sea coast. These blockades eventually led to the signing of protection treaties, institutionalizing Majutin claims and transforming them from pirates to protectors. And one of the other things they did was establish lighthouses, such as this one, which is in Ras Hafun. And for a long period of 50 years, there were tremendous acts of sabotage at these lighthouses because they were seen as they meant that there would be less shipwrecks, hence less opportunity for this kind of protection. These early 19th century encounters are part of a wider story of European expansion in the Indian Ocean, a story that shapes contemporary modes of understanding piracy and how we think about oceans and oceanic spaces more generally. From the purvey of Europe, specifically Spain and Portugal, the two dominant maritime powers in the 15th century, the Indian Ocean, with its trading routes, religion, kinship, and social networks, was a distinctive and denser social world than the oceanic worlds known to the Portuguese and Spanish. Vasco da Gama's entrance into this world in 1498, with assistance from a mysterious local navigator, variously claimed by coastal communities from Malindi to Malabar, and by Muslims, Christians, and Jews, marked the beginning of a truly global economy, connecting the trans-regional Indian Ocean trade network to the world of the Atlantic. As Ang Seng Ho has noted, viewed from the vantage of the Portuguese boat, what was strange about this rich world of the Indian Ocean was that no one state controlled it. Pre-colonial empires in Asia and Africa focused on revenue collection on land and did little to interfere with maritime trade. The European entry into this world did not so much rupture pre-existing trade networks as it did introduce new modes of organizing commerce and protection costs. The Portuguese, with scientific geographers assembled by Prince Henry the Navigator, were the first to think of this ocean as a single entity and attempt a systematic strategy to monopolize the means of violence within it. The Portuguese motto in the Indian Ocean can best be described as trade when possible, plunder when necessary. By capturing key ports and issuing cartas, or special shipping permits, they created and policed distinctions between licensed and unlicensed, regulated and unregulated, merchant and pirate. This is not to argue that these distinctions do not agree, but this idea of an enclosed space and the attempt to create enclosure was different in that mode, a shift from jurisdiction to sovereignty. The Portuguese venture was ultimately unsuccessful, as they failed to capture the port city of Aden and thus control access to the Red Sea. In opposition to this attempt at a trading post empire funded by the Treasury, the Dutch and later English ventures in the Indian Ocean were originally joint stock companies, granted crown monopolies over trade and the conduct of warfare. These companies often depended on local merchants for capital and to ensure protection of their ships. Contemporary maritime struggles reflect these historical encounters between regimes of protection. However, given the centrality of the Indian Ocean to energy transport and supply chains for the global shipping industry, these contests engendered new modes of regulation and economy. So here there are two images. We have one of the Indian Ocean as a sea of essentially wind currents and patterns, comes from the 18th century, and then another of supply chains but at the same time, as we see, the geography remains both somewhat consistent, and similar questions around access and mobility are central to both regimes. This vision of protection as a historically and ethnographically grounded practice and mode of engagement and encounter constructively moves us beyond state-centric understandings within the scholarly archive. Building on Charles Tilley's idea of protection, scholars like Diego Gambetta, Alpa Shah, and Timothy Raemakers have noted its centrality in creating state-like forms from the Sicilian mafia, Naxalbari movements in South Asia, and cross-border traders in Eastern Congo. These works fit within a larger body of literature on the emergence of governance structures in the absence of or in the aftermath of states. Protection, in their terms, often either represents a politics of coping or an alternative to the state, or indeed a prelude to state formation, as was for Tilley. In contrast, the world I describe is one that refuses this teleology of pirates to states or other forms of centralization. Instead of seeing piracy as a vestige of pre-colonial, pre-modern pasts or an alternative to states, I emphasize systems of protection that lie both within state structures and beyond, as regimes that bring together law and economy, and highlight interwoven natures of obligation, debt, and prestige even within these circuits. As the historical examples I began with show, protection is not simply about cost and calculability. It is a mode of both exercising jurisdiction and incurring debt, a way of emphasizing intimacy with the ebbs and flows of the Indian Ocean, and finally a lens through which to understand the inner working of economies that are sometimes labeled as piracy. In the next section, I focus on this economy of piracy to show the emergence of a regime built around practices of debt obligation and risk pooling. I do that through CAT. CAT or CAT was my entry into fieldwork and my first introduction to the inner workings of the pirate economy. A mildly narcotic leaf chewed widely in the Horn of Africa and Yemen, CAT is the fuel of male sociality in Somalia and incredibly popular while also legally and ethically contested. However, the plant loses potency within 48 hours, and the fact that while widely consumed throughout Somalia, it only grows in neighboring Ethiopia and Kenya has led to the creation of a trans-regional trade network linking farmers in northern Kenya to street vendors in Mogadishu, with millions of dollars in cash transacted daily. CAT comes to Somalia on regular flights and on heavily guarded trucks, and when I was there, sold for about $80 for a kilo. Be sure to give CAT to your special protection unit, guys, was the advice of a German academic I had been in contact with prior to leaving for Somalia. The Special Protection Units, or SPUs, are ex-fighters often affiliated with police forces or local militias in northern Somalia, tasked with the protection of foreigners. SPUs highlight the continuing centrality of these practices of escort in structuring interaction and engagements between Somalis and foreigners. In return for a payment, SPUs help facilitate mobility throughout the region of their jurisdiction and offer a guarantee of protection. The gift of CAT was a visible reminder of this agreement and the debts it entailed. The nature of CAT gives this gift a particular significance in ways similar to Anna Singh's reflection on the gifting of matsutake mushrooms in Japan. Given the expense of mushrooms and the quick time frame in which they must be eaten, the anthropologist Anna Singh notes, there's almost an element of coercion to accept the relationship that it brings with it. It is impossible to refuse the mushroom without wasting it completely. The expense and ephemerality of CAT give this gift a similar compulsion. To refuse, especially if one chews regularly, is to refuse the debt that is entailed in this, and given the short window of time, it is impossible to re-gift it. There are also ethical and legal considerations over who chews, who does not, and for the that are central to its consumption, its distribution, its illegalization, that I, in some ways, sort of bracket in this discussion. For me, I'm thinking primarily about CAT through this lens of debt, and as someone who is interested in a larger economic anthropology on debt, I wanted to ensure my protection in Somalia through creating as many debt relationships as possible, which meant spending a lot of time buying and chewing CAT. Given the range of quality, my early days of fieldwork were spent learning about CAT by observing sellers and buyers as they engaged in modes of assessment. CAT is a gendered economy in northern Somalia. While primarily chewed by men, selling is monopolized primarily by women. A large number of these traders would claim that if men were allowed to handle the CAT, they'd chew it all instead of selling it to make a profit. One afternoon, I was chatting with Aisha, a CAT seller in Garowe, the administrative capital of the autonomous region of Puntland, in the languid mid-afternoon period when only a few eager buyers milled about the market, waiting for the trucks to arrive from the airport, an arrival that transforms these public spaces into buzzes of activity. As we chatted about the distinction between Kenyan and Ethiopian CAT, Aisha got a phone call. A ship had been hijacked and the pirates had returned to shore and they wanted CAT. A deal was struck over the phone between Aisha and the caller, and soon after, when her daily supply arrived, she sent 2 sacks of this green leafy stimulant to the coast on the back of a pickup truck. Aisha had complained about piracy and lawlessness when I first met her. When after the deal, I asked her how she was able to guarantee payment. These were pirates after all. She replied somewhat unconcernedly, when they get the payment, they have debts, and they pay for them. And the person who called is in my Dia group. I have a claim on it, his money, if it all goes bad. This idea of the Dia group as central in facilitating this interaction is something I want to linger on now. So the Dia group understood primarily as an alliance formed by related lineages within a clan by means of a contract. Initially an oral agreement, this contract was transformed into written forms during the British Protectorate in 19th century Somaliland. And of course it comes from a longer lineage within Islamic law, thinking of blood payments, like the idea of Dia. But within Somalia, it states rights and duties of members with respect to the payment and distribution of receipts of blood compensation. Within the anthropological archive, somewhat functionlessly, the Dia group has been located, along with clan and primary lineage, as the trinity that organized Somali society and its fissures and fusions over the years. While Lewis, who's one of the, Ian Lewis is one of the proponents of this, has rightly been critiqued by a number of scholars, from Catherine Bestman to Ahmed Samatar, for ignoring the role of colonialism and history in shaping the forms of identity that proliferate in Somalia today. These scholars all agree on the role that Dia payments play in the legal and economic life, especially in a post-state movement. Dia groups function simultaneously to adjudicate payments required in the case of homicide, as well as a host of interactions that can be classified as custom. Additionally, the Dia group is a mutual aid society, a reservoir of capital, connection, and collateral in shaping commercial interactions. It is this combination of regulation and economy that makes possible a whole host of economic transactions, including selling kat to pirates. From this overview, the Dia group seems to fit within a wider set of literatures on moral economies and other forms of economic practice, commonly understood as the informal or the unregulated, specifically following Karl Polanyi as well as Clifford Geertz's definition of the bazaar economy. The notion of trust is seen as key in structuring these transactions across time and space. In his ambitious and influential study on global trade, the historian Philip Curtin emphasized the conception of diaspora in enabling transactional commercial networks in the pre-modern world. Drawing on Curtin, scholars of the Indian Ocean have noted the role of blood, kinship, genealogy, and shared history in establishing and maintaining transregional trade relations between and in the shadow of multiple jurisdictions and empires. The structure of Somali trade networks in the Western Indian Ocean can be seen as fitting seamlessly into this narrative of trust, trade, and diaspora. From Dubai to Lubumbashi, a network of diasporic Somalis engage in the movements of products ranging from dental chairs to rice. The Dia group is a central institution in structuring this movement of people, commodities, and cash. Yet, I suggest that thinking of this as simply customary law or an economy of trust obfuscates more than it reveals. Contemporary economic anthropology has recently sought to deparochialize the centrality of trust away from worlds such as Murid diasporic trade networks to the very heart of Wall Street and global finance. This work has admirably established and examined the materiality of financial transactions and the relationship between affect, network, and face-to-face interactions in moments of seemingly virtual commerce. At the same time, trust and ideas of custom spatially demarcate world into centers and peripheries, finance, and trade networks. Instead, I argue that we understand the Dia as a pooling mechanism for risk and investment. Highlighting the centrality of risk pooling reveals the conversions and movements between alliance, allegiance, and affinity, and the convergence of the risk of piracy from pirate to Dia across a set of embedded social practices. Crucially, focusing on risk pooling productively juxtaposes the political economy of piracy with counter-piracy, especially the work of insurance companies, in emphasizing how they both transform risk and regulation into a promise of protection and profit. As legal and economic instruments, Dia groups transform piracy into an economy of protection and also help create itineraries beyond it. To demonstrate this, I return once again to Kat. Abdi was an unusual pirate, quiet and soft-spoken, he lacked the visible markings, such as the fake Rolex, that made pirates stand out in Galkayo. Additionally, he was renowned for his psychic abilities that had earned him the nickname Laptop. In a particular pensive mood, Abdi one day noted, "Kat is the reason we have piracy," he told me. Afwe and Boya, these are all sort of major pirate bosses, as they were called in Somalia, they all came up with this idea instead when chewing Kat. We say that Kat makes you think big ideas. Piracy is one such idea. While perhaps overstating its role in shaping the economy of piracy, Kat is certainly central to this world. In the spaces of sociality that are structured by it, deals are struck and expeditions planned. In addition to food, water, and fuel, Kat is an essential ingredient when boats go out to sea. Structured as a credit economy, these initial supplies represent moments of investment for a variety of local businesses. As Abdi explained, even before I leave land, I'm already in debt. The supplies, the boat, the fuel, they're all owned by different people. Becoming pirate, thus I argue, is about becoming indebted. These debts, built on the structure and the infrastructure of diya payments, are processes of embedding the economy of piracy within a social world of the Indian Ocean. Debt, as anthropologists from Marcel Mauss to David Graeber have repeatedly reminded us, is about relationality and the building, perpetuating, and ending of relationships. The debts of piracy, especially as they transform into the debts of diya groups, make money and obligations move in ways that constitute the system, as much as they are constituted by it. And it's this focus that helps rethink embeddedness beyond a static idea of the social. So I don't want to take these categories of social or legal and illegal as a priori, but seeing how they both emerge in this context and the transformation that Kat has as it moves from seller to buyer to pirate group allows one to track these forms of conversion that happen in this space. In addition to debt, the work of piracy is one of chance and waiting. As Hassan, the pirate protector introduced at the beginning, explained, we go out to sea and we wait. When we are waiting, we are eating, we are chewing, we are talking. We make plans about who will go up first and how we will do this. I keep thinking, when all of this is happening, everything I eat and drink is putting me into debt, he said. So I hope to be able to catch a ship. This idea of catching a ship, qabza, is how the act of boarding and hijacking was narrated by those involved in this world. In my larger project, I highlight the sort of histories of capture and redistribution on land and sea, and how piracy sort of transformed from a response to fishing vessels, to the protection of those vessels and informal coast guards, into the kidnap and ransom economy. So another thing that was peculiar and particular to Somalia was that ships were held for, and ships and crew members were held for hostage. This was not about smuggling in the sense that you have in Southeast Asia or oil bunkering as happens in Nigeria. This was about an interruption and then an exchange that was built around that interruption. So it's this particular nature that brings in uncertainty. So part of what I'm trying to understand in my work is how uncertainty becomes a space where debt as well as different kinds of obligations get created. And so the uncertainty of capture begins a whole set of transactions and debt-credit relationships. Ships are anchored just offshore in cell phone range, and hostages and hijackers share a strange sort of domesticity in the weeks, months, and sometimes years it takes for negotiations to transpire. Guards and hostages cannot leave ships, and food, water, and kat is brought in daily. We wait before we catch a ship, and then we wait afterwards, said someone. Waiting is not a time between work, but an integral part of this work of piracy. As guards wait, they chew kat, they eat food, drink water, use cell phone airtime, often to buy goods that range from everyday items to things like pink limousines. Debt and payment obligations are constructed in this moment of waiting, and networks of investors, entrepreneurs created while waiting for the ransom. As soon as a ship is captured, I'm always on the phone, said one of these creditors. People will call me and other relatives saying they want to invest in this. Some will sell food, some will hire. Cooks, the kat merchants are the first to call. I keep an account book. The shopkeepers have their own account book. We know how much everything and everyone is owed through these negotiations. And then he looked pensively and said, I think piracy is a lot like accounting. So it's this, and here we can see on the coast roughly there's a cargo ship that was hijacked. So there's always this spectral presence of these ships, and as these ships are waiting, there's a whole financial transaction and a social transaction that is happening. And so this was always the sort of presence when I was doing field work of these ships and the potential forms of value that they had, and trying to understand how different people located within the coast and elsewhere understood that. Drawing from the resources of the Dia Group, a joint stock enterprise emerges in the aftermath of hijacking. Like the historical joint stock companies in the Indian Ocean, the proliferation of account books and the creation of shares once ships are captured are premised on payments of risk pooling and profit sharing. Capture is certainly no guarantee of payment, which varies greatly based on the structures and racial inequalities that constitute global shipping. The aftermath of hijacking is a moment of encounter between this Dia Group and the world of counter-piracy that is structured around opposing logics of risk and protection. In the brief concluding section, I now turn to this maritime world and the encounter between piracy and counter-piracy. Insurance and protection. In one of the more surreal moments of fieldwork, in 2011, I found myself attending the Lloyd's City Dinner, an annual celebration of the insurance industry. I had been interning at a maritime insurance company in London, and given the record number of hijackings, piracy was going to be a central theme for this dinner for this year, and the topic of a keynote address delivered by the NATO Secretary General Anders Rasmussen. My co-workers decided that as the pirate anthropologist, I should attend this dinner, and I found myself at a table listening to the NATO Secretary talk about counter-piracy. After a somewhat standard accounting of NATO's role, the Secretary turned to the heads of Lloyd's Insurance and explained the similarities between insurance companies and NATO. Like Lloyd's, Rasmussen said, NATO is in the insurance business. We spend a lot of time assessing global risks, and we invest heavily with our warships and our men in diminishing this risk, not only for allies, but for our global partners. And like Lloyd's, when disaster strikes somewhere in the world, often the first call is made to NATO to deal with its consequences. This conflation of NATO, a sort of military body, and Lloyd's, the insurance contractors, was met with an appreciative nod at my table and underscores the centrality of protection within this world of maritime insurance. In his analysis of risk, Ian Hacking argues that the origins of risk lie in the practices of 16th century Venetian merchants who got this from Arab traders, accounting for losses incurred in oceanic long-distance trade. As Mary Poovey discusses, the uncertainty of oceanic voyages represented limits to accounting. Balanced bookkeeping required details about merchant activities, primarily the dangers and uncertainties of being at sea, to be written out of the record. In the beginning, risk was the unaccountable, the omnipresent yet uncertain danger of leaving the solidity of land and heading down liquid paths. The story of modern maritime insurance is a story of enclosure. It's a story of this transformation from uncertainty to risk. It is of institutionalizing earlier modes of managing risk and the purification of insurance from a variety of seemingly similar practices, namely interest and gambling. In addition, insurance, specifically maritime insurance, is an economy of protection that mirrors the modes of risk pooling and redistribution highlighted earlier within the worlds of Dia. The free seas of contemporary shipping are ones without strong state regulatory oversight, and insurance companies, through their ability to decide what can and cannot be insured, create de facto systems of regulation over global shipping, and as I argue here, over the broader global economy of counter-piracy. The governance of maritime insurance is not simply a system of regulating and indemnifying individual ships or shipping companies, but of shifting costs across this global economy in ways that move beyond techniques of calculation to the allocation of profit, opportunity, and indeed violence and suffering. In spite of drastic transformations in global shipping, from logistics to containerization, the practices of maritime insurance have remained relatively unchanged since Edward Lloyd transformed his coffee shop into a location for risk pooling the hazards of maritime trade in 1688. In general, insurance consists of four parts: what is a cargo insurance for goods that is carried aboard ships, protection and indemnity clubs, P&I clubs, that protect third-party liabilities, such as damage to ports, environmental costs, like oil spills, and hull and machinery policies that insure the actual body of the ship, and war risk policies that cover losses caused by deliberate acts of third parties, and piracy is often included in this. Here I focus on the war risk cover as a specific mode of managing risk pooling and redistribution. And right here is a map of that war risk cover. This is what an insurance company looks at. And as we can see here, what's the highlighted area, this whole region became a war risk area, as is Nigeria and parts of Southeast Asia. So what this means is as soon as a ship enters there, they pay a higher premium for transiting through that. In October 2005, partly in response to a post-9/11 reimagining of threat and the attacks on the USS Cole and MV Limburg, the Joint War Risk Committee at Lloyd's, which is the central body that decides this, reclassified piracy outside of standard insurance policy into war risk. A key distinction between this policy and the regular hull and machinery is that war risk cover is a spatial practice based on the proposed itinerary of a ship. Certain areas of the world are constructed as high-risk areas, and ships transiting through that region pay a higher premium. Additionally, war risk cover is in fact negotiable, and no one ship pays the same cost for actually transiting through that. It is not calculated from indemnity tables. And ships can reduce costs of coverage by following certain recommended practices, such as updating satellite navigation, or in the case of ships transiting through the Gulf of Aden, hiring private security guards. So this negotiability of war risk cover is, among other things, a mode of reflecting and indeed determining the distribution of violence. If you have private guards, we will pay less, which creates then a privatization of violence at sea. And oftentimes it would be, these are highly socialized encounters. So it's, I know this shipping company, I know the captain, he's a good guy, as opposed to someone else, so we will charge you less. So there's a way in which this idea, again, of trust is not simply located within the spatial practices of Somali groups, but in fact is central to how shipping is regulated through the war risk cover. So the war risk cover, like the DIA group, socializes risks through the creation of a redistributed economy. In 2008, following the upsurge in acts of piracy off the coast of Somalia, the Joint War Committee added the Gulf of Aden as a war risk area, requiring merchant vessels to cancel their hull and machinery policies and take out this cover, a policy that costs significantly more than standard ship insurance. Given the potential for high payouts, war risk is not calculated through standard actuarial models, but is a flat fee. And it's often something like 0.5 to 1 to 2%, which initially I thought, well, that doesn't seem like a lot. But then when you think of a cost of a ship is somewhere between 10 million or so, even 1% of that per transit is a significant amount that gets added to this. So most amounts are about $50,000 US dollars per transit that get added to transit. Initially, during my research, I would be puzzled as to why this was a major concern until I realized how much an oil tanker, for example, would have to pay. Which raises an interesting question: why ships pay insurance companies instead of dealing directly with pirates, as they have historically done in many other oceanic spaces. War risk cover both individualizes insurance and transforms this logic of protection. Instead of distributing risks, as insurance contracts do, across a standard global industry, a special class of customers is created and risks redistributed through payment systems that are not built on actuarial models, but on networks of obligation, trust, and connection. The individualized nature of this coverage and its pay-per-voyage system means a whole host of considerations emerge, including things like ethnicity, trust, and other modes of kinship that we often never associated with this. Like the DIA group, the war risk cover provides a moment for investment for numerous insurance companies. From 2009, ShipSafe, the company that I had worked for, provided war risk cover for transit in the Western Indian Ocean, along with a kidnap and ransom package to provide what Jack, the chief underwriter, termed a comprehensive policy of protection. This policy mirrored the DIA group in that it created a redistributive enterprise, though in this case, this involved lawyers, negotiators, pilots, and other assorted experts who are paid certain percentages off this war risk fee when ships are hijacked. Seeing DIA groups and insurance companies within the same frame, while a bit jarring, allows us to observe the shared modes of risk pooling and redistribution that constitute seemingly disparate worlds. This is not to argue for an equivalence or a return to formalist legal anthropology that saw case method and contract law everywhere it traveled. Risk has different genealogies within Dia and different temporalities. Nonetheless, both articulate a claim for protection. Hassan, the self-proclaimed pirate introduced at the beginning of this talk, would often joke that he gave ships that had been released by him a license and a receipt. As he liked to point out, no ship is ever hijacked on the way from Somalia after they have paid the fee. Similarly, insurance companies would point to the marine insurance policy as their guarantee of protection. Thus, the protection of piracy and the protection of insurance simultaneously seek to enact forms of jurisdiction without sovereignty over processes of movement and mobility in the global shipping economy. Taking these processes together is both a mode of deparochializing the world of piracy, rendered often anachronistic or criminal, and an aberration in a world of containers and logistics, and a vantage point onto the violence, regulation, and labor that are at the heart of these practices of accumulation, exchange, and redistribution. Protection as a legal regime, as an economic practice, and a mode of structuring exchange and debt, thus moves beyond binaries of formal and informal, states and non-states, legal and illegal, that remain central to how we conceptualize polity and mobility today. I returned to Somalia and to Aisha, the cat dealer, as a way of conclusion. Once the cat had been sent to the coast and the remaining bundles sold in the market, our conversation returned to piracy. I asked Aisha if she was worried about the US State Department or Interpol or anyone else tracking piracy money. Someone ignoring my question, she launched into a long critique of piracy for promoting what she termed drunkenness and illegal sex. Immediately after, and without a moment of hesitation, she began an equally impassioned critique of financial interdiction and attempts to track money, which she argued failed to distinguish between business and theft, between halal and haram. She said, if you track money like this, we are all pirates. I am a pirate too. So, is Aisha a pirate? My research shows that this is a fundamentally misleading question. Yes, according to an international legal apparatus for funding and supplying boat hijackers, Aisha is indeed a pirate. But according to her, she's an innocent entrepreneur paying into her Dia group. Protection thus offers to bring together these disparate frames and show not just as alternatives or necessarily critiques of each other, or even functional equivalents in divergent contexts, but rather different faces of an interwoven system that connects us here to the worlds of piracy and counter-piracy. Thank you.
Jatin will be taking questions, so
Yes.
feel free to.
I haven't had a chance to formulate the question yet, but I'll give it a shot. And I want to thank you very much, Professor, for your very engaging talk. But I want to go back to one of your opening theses, which is trying to relate, or at least move away from the narrative that relates piracy to the performance of the state, specifically state failure, and ask you if it's not in fact maybe connected to the success of the state in the sense, specifically in that region, where it seems to me that in the course of the 20th century, and specifically in the case of the Gulf, there was a socioeconomic reorientation away from sea-based mercantile activities towards, and the reorientation was towards, it was away from sea-based, long-standing sea-based mercantile activities towards state-sponsored and internationally financed projects to develop and exploit land resources. And whether that did not necessarily have an impact on these long-standing maritime affiliations, and piracy may be, in this sense, maybe a lingering pulse from these long-standing connections that defy the modern state in the region. And the second, I guess I'll call it a question, but I'm wondering if you're also trying to rewrite movement into the history of this region, because I think the control of a territorially based space is the core of every modern nation state. And so the historical narrative really writes out movement specifically. But here, again, it seems that piracy is one way of rewriting movement into the narrative of this region. And here I'm defining movement as the circulation of humans, capital, commodities, along networks and links that, again, defy nationalist categories.
Mm-hmm.
So again, I'm not sure the second part is the question,
Right.
but I'd like to hear an answer anyway.
Yes, no, thank you. Should I just answer? Or
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, no, thank you for both. This is absolutely, I'll start with the second one. In some ways, that's precisely, I'm thinking about the shift to jurisdiction, to this idea that, looking at these long-standing practices that were both on land and sea, that were not necessarily about controlling resources in the sense that we understand, creating that obligation that states do, say, through taxation of a citizen and subject, or kinship, which is, again, these modes of integrating, incorporating strangers as familials and then rooting them within the home or the domestic. So it's about trying to understand this space of encounter where claims are made on one another, claims often through violence and through the management of that violence, and they are hierarchical. So this isn't a kind of fetish of movement as a horizontal necessarily space, but that these are temporary and that they allow for disavowal, they allow for abandonment. So thinking of primarily bringing that history back in, and also that into the sort of contemporary of thinking of this other space outside of kinship and citizenship, of forms of relationality that I think are central to how strangers have encountered each other. So even going back to travel narratives from Ibn Battuta, who is one of the first instances of this attempt at thinking of protection and Aban in Somalia. When he arrives in Mogadishu, he is essentially captured and taken to a merchant house, and then when they find out he's a Qadi, he ends up elsewhere. But this idea of what is entailed in capture beyond simply just a form of interruption. So it's absolutely about rewriting mobility, and not as a vestige of an older pre-oil, pre-landed past. So I guess that's how I would relate to the second one. Yes, so this is both, it is a vestige in some sense, but it is also central to how various kinds of imperial projects are still happening in this space. Like they're, instead of thinking of part of the re-territorializing of no longer having troops on the ground, all of this kind of what is the drone, but a form of kind of hovering protection. So thinking of that, of how can we open the box beyond also a form of imagining colonization as the end result of these practices, and the certain kind of logic that oil and oil economies, which were built on the ground, required, and they erased this history of pearling, these kinds of salvage capture that happened at sea. So part of it is bringing all of that back and saying that they lingered throughout even periods where we thought that they had moved away. So thank you for that. Thank you.
I was wondering if you could speak briefly just about some of the logistical challenges of doing research in Somalia. I mean, both like in country, as well as what I would imagine is some level of resistance from home research and funding institutions. And what advice would you give for an aspiring anthropologist looking to do fieldwork in a similar type of environment? Thank you.
Thanks. I just, I have a student who wanted to work in Chechnya, and I was like, I don't think you should. And she was like, but you worked in Somalia. I thought you would be sympathetic to that. But, I think in some ways there's so much of it was very contingent, and in terms of the logistics of field work, I had initially thought I would focus more on Kenya and the question of legal trials. And I got to Kenya, started research, and as often happens, the trials were declared unconstitutional by a high court judge, so there was nothing happening at the court anymore. And where the court is located in Mombasa, right near is the old port, and I started hanging out there, and there were these dhows, and that would be going into Somalia and continued. So I started wondering, how was it that these ships were able to move in this water where it seemed like you had pirates and counter-piracy simultaneously regulating them, And that became an entree into this world, was through this question of trade. Also, when I got to northern Somalia, most of my connections were these traders who often read me as, even when I tried to say otherwise, that as a Kenyan Indian trader, merchant, who was obviously fishing for commercial opportunities, if I can pun on that. But so part of it is just recognizing that we are kind of how we locate ourselves within these wider movements, and for me that became the entree into that. And a lot of it was contingent. It's not something, I haven't been able to go back to Somalia for the last 2 years, in part because with the Kenyan invasion, because I was seen as Kenyan, there is now a sort of form of hostility towards my return, or at least I'm told that they cannot guarantee protection in the way that they could. So it is having that sense of recognizing that, in spite of ourselves, we are always read as being, initially it was, are you Al-Qaeda or are you a CIA spy? Like, where do you fit? And they're like, oh, you're a traitor, that's the third space. And so in terms of advice, it would be recognizing that, that you were always located, but that all of these figures, right? So the whole project is about how this warship is part of a longer history. So your presence as an anthropologist is located as a longer history of these kinds of presences, which in terms of a practical matter, it's to then think of, how do you both marshal that, but also recognize the kinds of limitations that places on both evidence and so this project is not necessarily about the true story of northern Somalia, but it is about trade and encounters of protection in northern Somalia.
Hi, thank you so much. That was really wonderful. I have a question about intimacy and risk and the intimacy of risk. And you say that the ocean, you're looking at the ocean as an intimate space and it's intimate knowledge, and understanding risk is sort of that the maritime insurance understands risk of ocean travel in this intimate space as at the limit of accountability. And now there's this movement towards the closure, and I'm wondering if you could just say a little bit more about how you understand intimacy and risk, and that these are connected as you're looking at these networks of debt, which are also networks of intimacy.
Thank you. That's fascinating. It is definitely something I'm thinking of, the different spaces within which these practices of intimacy are performed, or this kind. Again, it's that the sense of part of the whole project is an attempt to account for encounter and the encounter between. So the book is structured with this encounter of a pirate skiff takes the sort of most stereotypical mode in which piracy is rendered to us, the pirate skiff and the large tanker, and saying what are the histories, what are the forms of relationality through which this encounter can be narrated, and in that sense, intimacy is a way to think about precisely the kinds of relationality that are built as one moves from land to sea, from the hold of a ship where you end up spending a lot of, and so many of the seafarers would, this is, in some ways, it's a concept that comes from the ethnography. A lot of the seafarers would talk of this strange intimacy of hijacking, where one has to spend months, years not knowing what will happen, but you are kept alive, not out of a sense of kinship or camaraderie, but because there's the potential for your conversion into value, into capital. But that still requires sharing meals and figuring out what kinds of things you like. So in that sense, it's trying to say these things get written out of our record of thinking of something like piracy, which is either a question of legality, of geographic space where this happens, or a question of economic practice, right? So are pirates in the kind of Atlantic sense these radical critiques of capital, or are they in fact, as some have argued, this sort of vanguard of capitalism? And so it's about also thinking of how can the pirate as a figure be understood outside of those frameworks? So intimacy is a way of imagining these kinds of relationality, and certainly connecting risk and debt. So and thinking of these concepts that are often both tied to number abstraction, and so part of it is working with other scholars who are rewriting these histories and saying finances, everywhere we see number and finance is not simply a process of abstraction, but that there's labor that's involved in this, and to kind of foreground that. So what happens when we foreground that as opposed to the abstract creation of value, which is central to global shipping. Well, we know the way commodity chains do that, and so it's thinking how the lingering of this, the presence of this, and what that requires ethnographically and what that requires theoretically to think of. Thank you. Thanks.
What has happened to the incidence of piracy? Is it up or down, and why?
So there's been so in 2012, when one way to not pay war risk cover, to pay a low rate of war risk cover, was to hire armed guards. So one of the things that happened in 2012 was the weaponization of merchant shipping again. So something that we have a long history of creating a distinction between commercial shipping and non-commercial ships. And from 2012, what we see is through the hiring of private guards, a muddying of that category, which was tried to establish during the kind of creation between the end of privateering. So what has happened is that private security companies have taken over, alongside, navies still are present, but private security companies have taken over ship protection, which led to, in the last 2 years, a rapid decline in the successful incidents of piracy. Part of it is just increased violence at sea. The things that these companies don't have to report publicly when they fire rounds to scare off small skiffs. And so some of that has been, but also because piracy was funded through the system of it was not about selling cargo or other thing, it was funded through the system of risk management. A lot of major players who were involved in it left after a few years because it wasn't as profitable as they had envisioned. And also there were rumors of oil, offshore oil that happened in Puntland, so the Puntland government got involved and said that we need to actually have a safe space at sea, and so there were negotiations with some of these financiers. So there's a series of factors both on land and sea that have resulted in a drop in at least the hijacking of commercial shipping. What has happened is an increase in the return of fishing trawlers and other forms of illegal and unreported fishing in these waters, and as a result, more confrontations between. So some of these groups have become protection systems for these fishing trawlers, who will hire local militias essentially to create a form of temporary sovereignty at sea. Say, this is our area, don't let anyone else come in. So this has been happening in the north, which indicates, and which was what was happening in the 1990s. So if we think of piracy as piracy cycles, we've kind of gone back to the 1990s with what's happening. And a number of people have said that once navies leave, once all of this attention deflects, they will still be, there's an idea that there will be another upsurge in piracy. So right now there is a temporary radical decline, but I do think it is temporary, or at least it shifts. There still is, that question remains of protection and violence at sea. It just has shifted its targets from commercial shipping to working with fishing trawlers, and that's not a story we hear about as much.
Could I just follow up?
Yeah.
Is it not the case that there was a time when there was a lot of piracy in the Straits of Malacca and in Southeast Asia? And how would you compare the measures adopted here and the effects they had, measures adopted in Southeast Asia?
In terms of Southeast Asia, there was, and in fact, these days it is, I think, alongside Nigeria, if I'm not mistaken, the highest rates of piracy. So there is a lot of acts of piracy that happen in the Straits of Malacca. But when this happened in 2002, when in the 1990s and early 2000s, when there were a great increase in acts of piracy, we had the creation of a regional policing entity between Indonesia, Singapore, Malaysia, that essentially said we will take care of this sea. So, and it was almost a sort of enclosure that happened roughly both in the Straits of Singapore here and also around here, and that had a significant impact in reducing acts of piracy. It was just a militarization of the sea space, which cannot happen in the Horn of Africa, primarily both because of geography. You don't have an archipelago. What you have is, I mean, you have the Red Sea, but most incidents of piracy, these are all, started happening, including all the way in the Mozambique Channel, further out here. So it isn't an archipelago, so it's a different way of imagining what the sea space is. And also, Moluccas were tied to it was basically taking either oil bunkering, so it was tied to a sort of secondary economy that depended on piracy. So there are parts of Thailand where you have, Supermarket Beach is a location in Thailand where essentially containers end up showing up, and that there isn't that system in Somalia. Somalia was primarily hijack and a sort of kidnap and ransom economy. And part of it is maybe access to global markets, which you don't have in East Africa as much as you do in Southeast Asia. So that was one of the other reasons, was there was a clampdown. It was easier to clamp down on piracy in the Straits of Malacca because of the presence of these regional players, and also the fact that most of this was about a market of not counterfeits, but a secondary kind of market, which it was easy to start clamping down on land. Yes.
Thank you again for sharing your work with us. My question is a methodological one. I was wondering if you could go into more detail about the kinds of daily activities, research practices, forms of participant observation, if you think it would be appropriate to call them that really shaped your social relationships when you were doing work in Somalia.
Thank you. In terms of methods, it was a mix of a lot of hanging out, like this sort of being stuck in a place, because you show up and you don't necessarily go say, can I meet the pirates? Right. And so oftentimes it was, well, what do people do? They go to Mafrish, they chew, they drink tea, and you end up sort of, it felt very like classic Gertzian anthropology of just deep hanging out and finding out the price of goods, because again, people thought that I was a trader, so they were like, oh, you're in Kenya, there's a tax on cars that is 50%. What if we got together? Do you have a contact at the border that we can bring the car, and here are the cars that are coming? And I was like, can I see a car being unloaded from a boat? So I went in and looked at, just took some pictures of cars being unloaded, and they were like, oh, it's okay, he wants to ship cars to Kenya. and that it was a lot of that. It was a lot of trying to understand cargo and what cargo meant and how things moved from point A to point B, and spending time on ports, at ports, and on boats, not actually sailing too far because no one was willing to take me. But I did sail on container ships and did some naval patrols as well. So there was also this recognition of thinking methodologically. Part of the project is not saying that piracy is a Somali question. Piracy is a larger frame through which to understand this encounter. And so it meant moving across that space that is created by this idea of piracy. Sorry.
So thank you for the presentation. I have a couple of questions. One of them is, I came a few minutes ago, so I'm going to but how does the deer how does that connect to the virus aspect of it? And also with the illegal fishing, one of my jobs right now is looking at the illegal fishing of course of Somalia, not Somalia, Puntland. And there's been an increase of illegal fishing and stuff, right? How do you see that from your experience in Puntland? How do you see that affecting piracy and illegal fishing?
In terms of the illegal fishing, yes, you're absolutely right. There's a large, one of the things that people used to say in Puntland was, thanks to the pirates, we have the trawlers have disappeared. And now that we have no pirates, they were like, these were our guardians of the sea. And once they're gone, now the trawlers are back. And one of the ways, what I've heard of from some people is a number of former pirates going into the protection of these trawlers. So there's that form, but also the confrontations that have happened between local fishermen around Hafun and so groups that are going back into piracy. So both the conflict and cooperation, and I think that's very much the key in thinking about the relationship between fishing trawlers and local communities. Is in part due to the fact that there isn't, right, a market for fish necessarily in Puntland. It is fish as commodity has far more value as an export item than it does when it's eaten, if it is even eaten on land. And so part of that is the fact that fishing was always driven historically as a form of currency that could be then exported like goats and like charcoal for a while. So in that sense, it is to understand this not simply as a kind of sustainable local economy that is encroached upon, which it was, but fishing was always marginal to livestock rearing and other forms. So, and part of its marginality meant that people would say, like, apportion during the Siad Barre regime as well as later would apportion fishing rights to foreign companies. So this kind of licensing system that no longer exists, but is still, this is a variation of that. So in terms of fishing, that's, I think, and with the dia, it's a way of trying to understand, I guess, of thinking of how risk pooling works. So as a mode of, how is it that, the question of how are forms of relationality created, how is a contract and a risk pool created, and taking, and often because there is a sort of obligation, a religious obligation to pay into one's dia group. There is and a form of redistribution that happens. This isn't, and I want to sort of emphasize that, this isn't to say that dia is a source of piracy funding or any of that, but rather to see how distributive networks work horizontally and it seems like in the Somali case, because piracy entailed piracy like other kinds of economies. So this is the same with livestock, this is the same with chap, like other kinds of economies that are built on contingency. The dia and all of these frames become ways of managing contingency. So I'm interested in how the contingency of piracy, the fact that you didn't know if you could capture a ship, and what do you even do once you capture a ship? How does that get transformed into socialized in a very everyday sense of the kinds of obligations, how one reaches across space and scale to create networks? So it's thinking of it as almost an infrastructure.
I guess you kind of answered my question. I mean, I was, but I just wanted to just clarify one thing in terms of contingency of this question of kind of protectionist piracy. There's several ways in which it's happening, and I wanted to just get a sense of, on the one hand, there is this kind of distinction that's being made by the British or whoever the colonial powers are coming in terms of calling these syndicates or these modes of protection as piracy as opposed to trade.
Right.
And it was an interesting correspondence with the Sultan, because how are they deciding who is rightful, right-bearing person to deal with a sort of obligatory relationship, and who is being considered as a criminal or pirate in that sense, and whether or not there's similar internally distinctions which are based around customary distinctions of ethnic groups who are seen to be at one hand pirates and other hand protectionists. Like, is there that kind of element going on within the coastal communities, depending on where you're not being that familiar with the region?
Right. No, absolutely. Thank you for the question. There, in fact, yes. So with this idea in the 19th century, even the idea of the Majutin Sultanate was one that emerged as someone who was able to negotiate that role. So to convince the Italians or the British that in fact I'm the person you should sign this protection treaty with, and this happens across the sort of Horn of Africa simultaneously because there isn't that interest in deep-seated colonialism at this point, but at the same time, this is right around the opening of the Suez, Britain's move to have Aden, to understand, there has to be a presence. There's a sort of, the Ottomans are there, the Italians are there, the French are there, and one of the ways that they go about creating clients was handing out lots of cash and weapons. And so you could, in order to protect what this future flow of trade to India, and so in Massawa and other places, there was a way that the British entry, they weren't coming in as the conquerors necessarily, they were coming in as creating this clientship. And and often just who was able to negotiate that. So the stories of Aban that are narrated, those stories of the Bokor are often sometimes boat captains who were able to transform their ability. There was a shipwreck, and they got there first, and they protected all of these survivors from the Hadr Awal or some others. So and then the poetic tradition is where I found traces of how this was narrated. So it's like this is how one becomes a protector, but this is also like the failure to do that is also then like comes out in these same poetic traditions from the 19th century where people are mocked and said he had a mandik, the female camel, and that's the sort of symbol, and he had that and he let her go. And the idea that he had this access to the sea and he let that access go because there was the Alula rulers lost out to the lighthouse. So there's a poem about the lighthouse which basically says, like that's what happened to Alula. They were left with that.
I had a question about the economics of this all, and as you looked at the militarization and securitization of this part of the movement across water, sort of versus the idea of Aban or protection, and it seems to me, and so I'm wondering if you or anyone else has ever kind of run the numbers. I mean, I say this as an anthropologist, so I don't really mean run the numbers. I just mean looked at them. But to me, it seems like you've got piracy going on, and the ships, particularly the big ones, the commercial ones, are paying a certain amount of money to pirates, or they're or stuff's getting hung up or whatever, and then they decide that they have to hire armed guards and they have to pay all of this money for insurance, or as you laid it out. That just seems to me so much more expensive than buying off the pirates,
Right.
And yet it is. In the regimes of bureaucracy that we put out in the world, and that the one you've described that isn't actually a bureaucracy, but the dia and all of that sort of stuff, which is a relational, that Lloyd's and the banking and the shipping industries, they can put those numbers of, a guard or insurance into a spreadsheet. You can tell I don't know how to talk about numbers, but into one of those things. But they can't we paid, $200,000 to a bunch of pirates into one of those spreadsheets. And so there's kind of like, even though it seems just in terms of finances, much easier to pay off, or much cheaper to pay off pirates,
Right.
It doesn't fit into a bureaucracy that they can work in. Or, I don't know, tell me more.
No, absolutely, and that's one of the things. I mean, this is also when I realized that I would have to hire SPUs in Somalia, I wondered, for my SSRC, where would I put that? Like, hiring armed guards is not a category that even, so it is precisely about thinking, like, what kinds of categories are unmentionables, right? And one of the ways that, what's fascinating about how the insurance companies and shipping writ large has dealt with the question of cost is to transform these things into the direct costs of piracy. So there's a way that you have numbers that come out that say, and I spend a lot of time looking at these numbers, which as an anthropologist I was shocked by. This seems very obvious that this isn't a cost. Piracy only costs, in terms of actual ransoms, something like $100 million at its peak, $100 million. But the Oceans Beyond Piracy number of other, and even the World Bank report, the UN report, all of them said the piracy costs about $1 billion to the global industry. So there is a clear discrepancy here. But what happens is the war risk cover, the cost of having a naval destroyer at sea, all of that gets written into the cost of piracy. So the assumption, as opposed to the profits from piracy, right? Because war risk cover is a source of profit for the insurance company. It is a source of employment for the former armed guards who were working in Iraq but could no longer once sovereign immunity was taken away. And so all of a sudden they narrated it like that. They said, well, we were kicked out, or we left Iraq, and then we decided to get some boats and go out at sea. And so there's a way in which this idea of cost becomes very malleable in order to then justify this kind of counter-piracy, because we cannot, simply pay off a pirate, because there's a legal apparatus where that doesn't happen, and that's part of what I'm trying to understand by thinking through the DIA is the DIA group will also say we're not paying pirates, but how is it that we both end up creating the system where cost and calculation, everyone's making numbers and somehow saying that these numbers mean different things.
And
Is
in,
that?
yeah, and in the case of hiring guards and all of that sort of stuff, the money from that stays in, I don't really want to use the word first world, but it stays in that world, right?
Yes.
It doesn't ever go to.
No, you do not hire non-Western guard. I mean, some shipping companies have started to do what they call splits, which is where you hire two. So there's a whole hierarchy here of how private security is understood. So Israeli, US, UK, those are the three countries that are supposed to are the most expensive, but also the most well-trained private security companies. So the companies will hire 2 Americans, say that we'll give you 2 Americans and 2 Sri Lankans. And it is talked like that, and there's a whole way in which even shipping companies with sort of crew members, there's an ethnicizing of these categories that has a value to it. And so that's one of the moves to reduce costs is, instead of 4 American guards or 4 Royal ex-Marines, we will do a split. And that's how you talk about it. So this is something I've been trying to write about and thinking of what does cost mean.
Can I follow up then on this point? Because I had a question that was percolating and I think it's clear, but I just want to make sure then I also understood something in your presentation that relates to this. Because I think you were also saying that as much as the narrative of war risk coverage and cost sharing within the insurance industry is also about trust that's akin to a DIA group, right?
Right.
It's about ethnicity, language, familiarity, regime, right? So that, I mean, to me, that's the really interesting parallel that emerges from that. How on the ground, like in those deep hanging out moments, how do land-based Somalis see how do they imagine and narrate the morality, the normative implications of, right? So they don't say we pay off pirates, right?
Mm-hmm.
But just I mean, because I think in general I've understood it as sort of a illegal versus a kind of we're besieged by illegal trawlers, right? Kind of narrative, but maybe that's not how Somalis see it, that sort of latter side. I mean,
Well, that narrative certainly has power, and both because historically that was one of the reasons why. So the earlier instances of piracy were based around Puntland and Aid and other places, and when you go there, it is the story of both the destruction by the tsunami, but also of dumping and fishing, but especially around 2010, 2011, when I was working. Doing more of that. There was also a recognition, yes, but it's also not that, right? There's also, this isn't simply a story of poor fishermen at this point. We have people who have no idea of what going to sea means, or some of these people never even go to the sea. But there is still there's a mode of trying to reconcile, well, what does it mean? Is this haram? Is this halal? So there were movements, one of the ways that the UN tried to intervene in this was to actually have radio programs where you had sheikhs talk about how piracy is haram, but then you had counter stories about no, it's not, and a fascinating aspect of that was these stories of tricking pirates. So you would hear people talking about how you buy a Land Rover. That's one of the things that marks your entry into, you are now, because this was what NGOs, this is what the others. So there's a way in which the idea that you have a Land Rover now, so a pirate is I can get a Land Rover without becoming part of the UN, and this is what piracy means to me. And then there would be stories of often, and then this woman said that she would marry him, and then they went to the beach, and then she stole his Land Rover. And so this idea that you can trick a pirate, that's okay. So there's a sense that, yes, they are within a social world, but tricking them is not bad because the money that they got is bad.
Somehow.
Yeah, so it isn't the same.
yeah.
Just to follow up with that point, I'm Somali, so in Somali there's a lot of talks that we hear from people saying that people like this time money, millions of dollars coming in, and the people who are in the piracy business, they can't the dog hierarchy are also getting more richer because people are actually going to kidnap the fish. The ships are just food sources.
Okay.
But the money isn't really going through the community, so there's a lot of money that's popping into the community, and the poor can afford it, whatever. So how do you see that things, or what was the culture like when you were there?
So that became a way for people to say, well, why should and that was one of the reasons why Boya was kicked out, was because people said, well, no, you're not. This isn't a proper form of redistribution. In fact, water, you want to go get water, it's so much more expensive, and cat is more expensive because people are buying it on credit, and so there was that pushback also that happened, leading these people to, in some ways, being disembedded from these kinds of networks. And it was precisely because of this sense that Afwain, all of the, there's one class that was created. There was a kind of corporatization that happened on land where you could invest in piracy from Mogadishu, from other places, and make money off it without ever stepping on a boat. And those who ended up on boats ended up in debt, ended up dead sometimes, and often not sometimes. And so that aspect of it also was very strong in creating a counter narrative of moral critique against piracy.